Today I'll be reading from Philippians 4:12 through 13. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me.
Good morning, church. Good morning indeed. It's good to see everybody here this morning. Definitely appreciate, Bill, your comments for communion today. Those were really encouraging, well thought out. I really appreciate those. Can't find you now, but I appreciate them a lot. I will say that I had to take a little bit of a bigger piece than I normally do, and I'm curious if you all in the back actually got communion. Yeah, maybe. Good. But I did appreciate that a lot. Those were really good. And like Dave said last week, we read about one of these great stories in the Bible, the story of Joseph, one that I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. People from ages 3 to age 103 just all love this story, right? And every time you read it, every time you stop to study it, there's always something you can walk away with to challenge you, to kind of chew on mentally and grow on. And yet, I think this was just like a really bad Bible lesson I had as a kid that has stuck with me that now I'm going to share with you. Because whenever I think of Joseph, I think about a roller coaster. Okay, every time. I don't know how many of you are thrill seekers, but I absolutely love roller coasters. I love them. Growing up in Indiana, we got to come to Kings Island once a year, and I just dreamed about an opportunity where I could come all the time. And now I live 30 minutes away, and I go about once a year. So it hasn't changed very much, but I still absolutely love it. And ever since it went up, you might recognize this is the Diamondback at Kings Island. It is my absolute favorite. There's no twist. There's no unnecessary loops or anything to really kind of mess up your head. It's just really high ups and then straight down over and over again. Classic, as I like it. And that's exactly what I picture when I think of the life of Joseph. You know, he has some really, really good times. They just come crashing down and then seem to always slowly build back up again, usually to come crashing back down. Joseph has these high highs, and he also has these low lows. And I think that's part of why we like the story of Joseph so much, or at least that's what I think, because our life patterns this as well, doesn't it? We have really good moments in our lives, and we have really bad moments in our lives, and usually both of those stick in our minds for the rest of our life. There's some ups and there's some downs. And the lesson we get from Joseph is that if we follow God through the good, if we follow God through the bad, we're going to find ourselves on top when the ride ends. Just to summarize it, that's the basic story. If we follow God through the good, if we follow God through the bad, we find ourselves on top when the ride is over. Now, even though I've been talking about how much we love this story and how great the story of Joseph is and how much we love it, Joseph does not start off as a very likable character from the beginning, does he? Or at least not me. That might be because I'm an older sibling. I'm the oldest of 3 boys. How many of you have younger siblings? Yeah, a lot of you. Yeah, so you get this, right? You get that Joseph starts out as the annoying, frustrating little brother, like the stereotypical little brother. And there's some of you in here who are insulted, but I'm not going to apologize because you know what you did. You younger siblings, you know what you did to us. Some of you are on both sides of that. You have older and you have younger. But that's exactly what Joseph is. He's pretty stereotypical. He tells on his brothers when they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. The Bible tells us he brings his father a bad report of them. He also has these really prideful dreams about he's going to be so much greater and better than the rest of them. And while those are true, you don't really tell people that kind of a thing, right? I picture my youngest brother coming up to me and saying, hey, I had a dream that we cut a bunch of hay bales, but all y'all's bales bowed down to mine. I think I would just push him for having the bravery to tell me that. You know, it might have been true, but it's still a little infuriating. And then to top all this off, Joseph is the favorite child. And this isn't like the we all think we're mom's favorite kind of a thing, right? Joseph is the cut and dry favorite child. Hopefully you remember our sermon from last week, but Jacob is their father, and Jacob had 2 wives. Rachel, who he loved very dearly, but was barren. She couldn't have children. And then Leah, he wasn't as fond of Leah, but she did have most of the children. Well, later on in their lives, because God looked down on Rachel's pain, on her prayer, and he had compassion for Rachel. And the Bible tells us that he opened her womb, and she actually had a kid. And that son's name was Joseph. right? So this was literally the miracle child that they all loved so much. And so not only was he the favorite, but they wanted everybody to know he was the favorite. They made a robe, this like kind of coat, out of multiple different colors, which would have been very expensive, very special, and they had him wear it around to flaunt his specialness in front of all of his brothers. That's not good parenting advice. Don't go spend like $1,000 on one child and say, make sure you show all your brothers this, there's a lot of things in the Bible we emulate. That's not one of them. Understandably, the other 10 brothers, because he has another brother, you've heard the 12 brothers. One's not here yet. But the other 10 older brothers, they don't exactly found the Joseph fan club, right? They move on in life and they develop a resentment towards Joseph. And as resentment usually does, it creates a foothold for Satan to enter into his life and for Satan to make things worse, as he always seems to do. And while these 10 brothers are out watching livestock one day, Jacob, the father, sends Joseph to go and check on them and see how they're doing. And we read in Genesis chapter 37, "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. 'Here comes that dreamer,' they said to each other. 'Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal has devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams.' When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. 'Let's not take his life,' he said. 'Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him.' Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe that he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, and there was no water in it." This is more or less just a big well that's run dry. "And as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh. They were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, 'What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to these Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood.' His brothers agreed. So when the Midianites merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out from the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him out to Egypt." Now this is a little bit of an unrelated side note, but it's just too cool not to share. Outside the room 306 at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, there's a plaque with verses 19 and 20 from this here passage. Room 306 at the Lorraine Motel is the room that Martin Luther King Jr. spent his last night on earth. It was from that balcony that he was shot and killed. And that plaque, it reads, "Here comes this dreamer. Let us kill him and see what becomes of his dreams." But we know that Martin Luther King's dreams, they didn't come to an end that day when they killed him, did they? In fact, tomorrow we're going to take a moment and stop and remember the great things that he did. God even used Martin Luther King Jr.'s death to stir the hearts of many people and bring about the good change that God wanted to see happen. See, although that Satan fights continually against God and continues to wage war against God and his goodwill, God has yet to be defeated. And God oftentimes uses the evil things of Satan to bring about the good. Now, don't get me wrong, what's evil is evil, and what happened to Martin Luther King Jr. was evil. What happened to Joseph here is evil, but God continues to use evil for good. Now, if we look at the story of Joseph, I fought with my brothers plenty. I fought with them tooth and nail sometimes, but I never sold them. That's kind of a key contribution. I've never sold my brothers. And this story, what these brothers do here is so bad that Reuben looks like the good guy, and he's the one suggesting they throw him into a well, right? And he looks like the good guy here. But what makes all this worse, in my opinion, the worst part of all of this, is that Joseph has to process all this, right? He's not unconscious. They're not doing this behind his back. He is present and seeing all of this happen. He has to sit there and consider that that his brothers hate him. Like he knew that he wasn't one of his brother's favorites, but they were still his brothers, right? To have to sit there and to recognize how far their dislike, that their hate goes for you, must have just been absolutely heartbreaking. To have them sit there and talk about you, whether or not they should kill you or just sell you, is just absolutely horrible. To see the hate in their eyes as they push you into a well, and so forth. And it's not only this emotional trauma that Joseph has to go through, but he's about to have a pretty rude awakening as far as the world goes too, right? It's a pretty big transition to go from sheltered favorite child to slave, right? That's not an easy transition at all. And so we see this first major roller coaster plummet in his life. This first time he just shoots down. And it's a vertical, straight drop. This is not slow. This does not come easy. It's a straight drop down. And the question becomes, how does Joseph, or how does anybody move on from this? To experience something this hard, to experience something this life-changing, for to have everything you knew in the world completely change in just a matter of hours, how do we move on? And I think just through my own personal experience, and that a lot of people, they tend to shut down after something like this. They kind of continue on in an emotionless life that they just simply go through the motions. Or another popular one is that they motivate themselves with revenge, right? And consume all their thoughts with payback and getting back with somebody and getting even. And there are more options, there are more things that people go through with trauma like this. But none of these are healthy options, right? Shutting down, looking for revenge, none of those are healthy. And they're not what Joseph does either. See, what Joseph does is he chooses faith. He chooses faith. Regardless of what the people had done to him, regardless of what was coming up in his future, he chose to continue to walk with God. That was the most important thing he thought he could do. Over the pain, over the disappointment, the difficulty, the loss, whatever, he chose to walk with God through it all. And do you know how easy it would have been for him to completely abandon God? I mean, they took him to Egypt. Egypt, the land of hundreds and hundreds of God. It would have been so easy for him to come in and say, well, clearly the God of my father isn't working out well for me, so I'll just pick one of these. It would have been so easy for him to abandon his faith, but no, he stays faithful to the one true God. And brothers and sisters, this needs to be our default setting. When good things happen, when bad things happen, we need to make sure we make the conscious decision to live on in faith and to continue to walk with God, to choose faith. God has given us the free will to choose self-pity, to choose vengefulness, but what good has that ever done for anybody in the history of the world? Instead, we choose to live faithfully with God, trusting that he holds us in his hands. And he, in fact, does have a plan for our tomorrow. And so that's the kind of response that I would like to have through hardship in my own life. And we see through the life of Joseph that not only does he choose that path, but when he does choose it, his life is ultimately better for it. The story continues in chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to him in his care everything he owned. From that time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned. The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. See, God blesses Joseph's efforts. His master comes to trust him, and he's put in charge of the entire household. Everything this very important official owns, Joseph is in charge of. And the scripture is clear to us that these good things, that they came from God. They didn't just come from Joseph's innate abilities, that he was a very skilled organizer, though I believe he was. These things were blessings. They were gifts from God. God gave him success because he endured through the bad times and stayed in the presence of God. He endured through the bad times and stayed in the presence of God. And so in a very short time, Joseph has gone from almost being killed by his brothers to sold into slavery to being a foreigner in a new land with absolutely no future to now being the lead administrator of one of the most important people in the entire country in a very short time. And it's a faith that he has in God that allows all this to happen. When you trust in God, God is going to open doors for him. And now I stand up here and I try to make Joseph's success look appealing, right? That like, oh, look how good he has it now because he stayed faithful. And, considering what happened to him, that is absolutely true. But let's stop and admit something. This is not the life Joseph wanted. This is not the life Joseph would have chosen. A slave, a foreigner. Even though you're the head slave, you're still a slave. And he's a foreigner. He's away from his family. He's away from his homeland. This is not the life Joseph would have chosen at all. And I'm sure Joseph doesn't consider this being back on top. You know, in my mind here, I'm trying to say he was a favorite child, he had a good life, all these things happened to him, but look, he's back on top. Joseph would not have considered this to be back on top. This is not what he wanted. But God had still taken care of him, right? And being faithful isn't going to get you everything you ever wanted, right? I won't stand up here today and say, you know, if you're an obedient Christian, God will make you wealthy and he'll make you healthy and that's all you have to do. Like Bill was saying earlier, that's ridiculous. I'll never say that. And hopefully no one takes that clip out of my sermon and starts spreading it around. You know, you got to be careful these days. But Joseph was still a slave. He was still a foreigner. But because he chose to follow God, he was blessed within the situation he found himself. Within the situation of a slave, within the situation of a foreigner, he was still blessed. And he still succeeded under the care of God because he was faithful to God. You know, being baptized, becoming a Christian, it's not going to fix all your problems. I hate to see people who think it will, who come back to me a month or two after being baptized and say, well, hey, my life has gotten worse in X, Y, and Z areas. And I hate that because Satan's going to attack you a whole lot harder once you've tried to make this commitment. And I try to prepare people for that. But I think that you find when you commit your life over to God, when you follow God faithfully, that these burdens that you do have in life, that they won't quite seem as heavy. And as you live obediently, you'll find more happiness. You'll find more satisfaction in your life. And your eyes are going to be open to blessings that you didn't even know were there in the first place. And that's what it's like to walk with God through the bad. Everything isn't fixed, but you're blessed within your situation. And now, like all of our lives, Joseph's mountaintop experience, it doesn't last forever. Joseph's master's wife, in this specific situation, starts to take a liking to him, which causes him some problems. And then we read in chapter 39, verse 10, and though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or to even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the story. "That Hebrew slave you brought to us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, just as frankly as that. And this is where we just kind of like, man, we just feel real bad for Joseph now, right? At first, it was his family rejecting him, but he endured through that hardship. He found himself in a really good place. Things were seeming like they were back up. But then all of a sudden, someone lies about him and has him thrown in prison for something he absolutely did not do. In fact, what makes it worse is the thing that they accuse him of is the very thing he absolutely refused to do. We've been talking about how strong Joseph must have been to follow God when those hardships came. But maybe this is more impressive to me. The fact that even when things were going good, Joseph had not forgotten God. Now that he was back on top, now that his life was going well, Joseph was still faithful to God. You see, a lot of the world, they turn to God when things are bad. Have you experienced this? When things are bad. Sometimes it's us, too. I'm not just going to cast it out on the world, right? I've done this. I imagine most of us have. When things are bad, our focus turns to God a whole lot more. God, please help me. Please raise me out of this. God, please forgive me. But then when things get good again, God seems to slip away and become a little further in our thought process. We want him when things are bad, but when things are good, we tend to run our own abilities instead of God's. Joseph, on the other hand, he trusted God in the bad times, and he continued to cling to God when things got good. He wasn't lulled into sin by his comfortable situation, right? He stayed faithful to God and vigilant to do what was right. And as it turns out, a life lived in faith does not always feel like a blessing. Joseph absolutely did the right thing, but look what it cost him. Look what it cost him to choose to do the right thing. And that's one of the points I tried to make in this bulletin article this morning. We have to choose what's right, even when it's going to hurt us. Even when the consequences seem dire, we choose to do what's right. Because here's the truth. Whatever consequences the world might give us for following God will never compare to the consequences God will give us for following the world. Isn't that true? And the inverse of that is true as well. Whatever rewards the world might give us for following them will never compare to the rewards God will give us for following him. When following God is going to cause you social or mental pain, trust that God is going to bring you healing in your obedience, because he will. He did for Joseph, and he has for the thousands of years that man has walked on this earth. And whenever I consider this, whenever I think to myself that I have to do what's right regardless of what may come, I'm always put in my place a little bit. I'm always reminded that my perspective is limited. I really appreciate our brothers and sisters on other parts of the world, brothers and sisters in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia, who follow God in face of literal death. I pray that we would have their kind of strength to choose what's right regardless of what may come. And that's exactly what this is about. Choose what's right regardless of what may come. Joseph did that, and he wound up in prison. But again, he chose to stay faithful and obedient. And he rose to a better life again. Once again, he hit that rock bottom, but because he was faithful, because he was obedient, he improved his situation. He was still a prisoner, but he was made friends with the warden. He was put in charge of things. He gained responsibilities that bettered his life. And later down the road, we see these two officials of Pharaoh that are imprisoned and put in jail alongside Joseph. And they have these dreams that are a little confusing, a little bothersome to them. And Joseph comes to them. He interprets their dreams. It's a gift he has. And one of them has a good ending, the other not so good of an ending. I hope you all have read this week our reading plan. If not, I'd encourage you to go back to, because there's a lot of things we're skimming over in our sermon this morning. I'm hoping that you've read and enjoyed the content as we just kind of study it again together today. But what's most important to me about this part of the story is not so much that Joseph interpreted the dreams. It's not so much that one got a good verdict and a bad verdict. To me, it's how Joseph approached it. In verse 8, Joseph says, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Do not interpretations belong to God? Joseph knows that his ability to interpret these dreams, that any gift, that any blessing he's going to be to these people, all comes directly from God. And he gives God the credit first and foremost. And that's important to us. We always need to point back to God. Whether it's gifts he's given us, whether it's talents or possessions that we have, we need to use them for the glory of God and let the world know that we have them because our God is good. And that's all that matters. In the word of John the Baptist in John chapter 3, he must increase and I must decrease. I've always loved that. He must increase and I must decrease. And that's a hard message for us, especially in our me culture, right? But it's a message that Joseph learned well through the ups and downs of his life. And soon after this story, one of those prisoners gets reinstated into the palace of Pharaoh, and he moves on with his life, forgets his buddy back in the prison. But ultimately the day comes where Pharaoh himself is having these troublesome dreams. And this official remembers Joseph. And they call him out of prison. And they call him to help the Pharaoh, to give him an interpretation for his dream. And Joseph does so. But before he does anything, he points back to God. In verse 16 it says, Joseph says to Pharaoh, "It's not me, but God will interpret Pharaoh's dream." It's not me, but God will interpret Pharaoh's dream. What's interesting here is Joseph desperately needs the credit. He's in jail. He's in jail for something he didn't do. He doesn't deserve to be there. And helping Pharaoh out, helping Pharaoh find comfort and relief might be the one thing he can do to get himself out of prison. I got to say, if I was in those shoes, I don't know if I'd be as faithful as Joseph was. I think I'd be like, yeah, I can help you. If you want to help me, I can help you, right? No, Joseph says, it's not me at all, but God can interpret your dreams. He decreases himself to give the glory back to God. We should always point back to God. And then our story continues in chapter 41. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials, so Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of all my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater to you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot, a second in command, and the people shouted before him, "Make way." Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. See, after all the ups, after all the downs of Joseph's life, his faith and his obedience has led him back to a place of great power, great authority, of great respect, of comfort in his life, of luxury, of all these different things. He's no longer a slave. He's no longer a prisoner. He's no longer a foreigner, but now he's a prince, raised up by the hand of God. And the message of Joseph, the entire story to me, is one of endurance. He's an example of a faith that stayed true in the good and in the bad, the ups and the downs. And I pray that we would all have the strength of Joseph to remember God when things are going right, and then also to cling to God and trust in him when everything's falling apart. And at the center of all of that, through the ups and the downs, is to trust that God knows what he is doing. God knew exactly what he was doing through the entire story of Joseph. In fact, when Joseph interpreted that dream for Pharaoh, what he discovered was that there was about to be 7 years of plenty. 7 years where the harvests were going to be great, 7 years where there was going to be a ton of food, and then right afterwards, there was going to be 7 years of famine. And so what Joseph advises Pharaoh to do is to supplement, take some of the grain and some of the produce from the first year to supplement the next 7 years. To take what from the good to supplement through the bad. And he does it through his organizational skills, his managerial skills. It's funny to watch how all the ups and downs to his life, God gave him the exact amount of experience that he needed, at the exact time he needed it, to be exactly where he needed to be. And because he was faithful through it all, a lot of people were saved. Many, many lives in Egypt were saved. And beyond Egypt, all the surrounding nations. Like I said, I hope you read this story, because eventually Joseph's brothers, the ones who thought about killing him, now return to Egypt to find food because they're starving to death. And they go to that brother that they once thought about killing to find life. In fact, Genesis chapter 50, this is where it culminates really well. Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, and they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back all the wrongs that we did to him?" So they went forward to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these words before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God, of your father." Now I've always been kind of curious if Jacob actually said that, or if that's what the brothers are telling Joseph that Jacob said. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Another translation says, "What you intended for evil, God intended for good." So much in our life, so much in our world is intended for evil, but God is never defeated, and he continues to use it for good. God used the roller coaster of Joseph's life to save thousands and thousands of people from starvation. And I've always wondered how this story, or even how history, would be different if Joseph hadn't remained faithful. If Joseph had dropped his obedience, if Joseph had said, "You know what, I've done the right thing, I've tried hard, and this is where it gets me, I've had enough," what would have happened to those thousands and thousands of people who needed his guidance, who needed his protection later in life? God has a plan for all of us this morning, in the good and the bad. Whether you're on the mountaintop or whether you're in the valley, God knows where he's going to take you. The question for us is, are we going to stay faithful so that we can get there? Are we going to stay faithful so God can get us there? If you're here this morning and you're ready to live in the plan of God, if you're ready to have him guide everything that you've ever done, to see his plan for your life, or if you're here and you've just kind of fallen off the bandwagon a little bit, have you fallen off from this roller coaster of life and need the prayers of the church, won't you come as we stand and as we sing?